So moving right along, since we did have a slight delay, I would like to now introduce Elisabet Tiselius. She has joined us from Stockholm, where she is a community and a conference interpreter, and that is already an unusual combination. But she's also a professor and teaches interpreting at the University of Bergen and Stockholm University. And she's in the very last stages of her PhD. So this is somebody who truly has seen the large breadth of our field. Today she's going to share her findings from her research on interpreters and practice. So please welcome Elisabet.
Thank you so much. And I'm also, of course, very happy to be here and very excited about this whole event. So, yeah, I'm ready. Okay. My slides are not very interesting, by the way, for you watching on the web. So I have a question for you. You don't have to answer it now, but I'd like to ask you, do you practice? Because practice is really important for interpreters, right? We have to practice to acquire the interpreting skill. We have to practice to pass different exams. We have to practice just to do our job. In expertise research, deliberate practice is a cornerstone. It's one of the absolute conditions for reaching the top of any field. Whether you're a Wimbledon winner or a grandmaster of chess, a star surgeon, or even a very skilled taxi driver, goal-focused deliberate practice is what gets you to the top of your field. Yet, when I interviewed highly skilled simultaneous interpreters for my research and asked them if they practiced, they said no. They were even very clear about it and spelled out, I never practice. I was very surprised, of course, and I asked them, but surely you were taught to practice at interpreting training? And they answered yes, but I didn't practice at university either. They were very honest, you have to give them that. Before I continue my story, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about deliberate practice. As I said earlier, in expertise theory, deliberate practice is an absolute condition to become an expert. Expertise theory comes from psychology, and becoming an expert is not just about getting those 10,000 hours of practice that you hear about from time to time. Don't fall for that, because expertise theory postulates that experts, regardless of field, have the same strategies to reach the top. One of these strategies is deliberate practice. This is what differs experts from ordinary performers. But it's also how you go about that practice, about having a very clear goal, for instance. When experts practice, they don't just play a few arpeggios or learn a few new words. No, they have very clear goals, they set aside time, they know what they practice, they know what they want to achieve, and they often work with coaches and get feedback and so on. So the interpreters I interviewed, which is not the interpreter on the slide, because that's Andrei Kaminker, but the interpreters I interviewed fulfilled all the superficial criteria for what you and I would call an interpreting expert. They had worked for a long time, they were accredited to international institutions, they were considered good interpreters by their colleagues. One of the reasons I chose them was that I assumed they would be experts. But still, when I interviewed them, they told me, no, I don't practice. So according to the expertise theory, they wouldn't qualify as experts, and at least I was sure that they weren't deliberate at all about their practice. I have to admit that this left me quite desperate. But when I went back to the interviews told me a different story. For instance, although they said I never practiced at university, one of them told me the story about reading the daily newspaper every day, every word of it, at university. I don't know about you, but to me that is practice. Another interpreter told me about the endless word lists that were made at university. They told me how they prepared for different exams and how they go about adding a new language. It's also interesting how they said that since they became professional interpreters, they'd stopped reading books in a deck chair style. Nowadays, they would read anything from brochures to celebrity blogs in a much more attentive way. So, they also told me about how they prepare for different jobs, how they download podcasts, how they listen to the news, and I'm sure that nothing of this is new to you, because that's what you do if you're practicing interpreters, and you are practicing interpreters, right? But what has made me curious is, why don't interpreters label all this work they do practice? I'm also wondering if it matters whether we label a practice or not. I would bet quite a lot on the fact that any interpreting student at any interpreting program is at least told to practice outside class, or at best also taught how to practice. And it is a fact that most accreditation tests for interpreters are so challenging that we couldn't pass them if we didn't practice. And I know that because I failed twice, but you're not allowed to tell my students that. So how come very experienced interpreters, presumably at the height of their career, don't think that they practice? I have a few ideas that I'd like to share with you. The first thing that popped to my mind was that the only thing they consider practice was when they were in front of a client busy interpreting. The interpreters I interviewed worked full-time as interpreters, so after a whole day of interpreting, maybe that would not be the kind of light entertainment you're looking for. And also, in fact, you are probably practicing quite a lot while you're working. I'm sure, though, that we would all be better interpreters if we spent free time interpreting with a coach. But I'm also sure you'll agree with me that there's more to practice than that. So, then I thought that maybe, because they also mentioned that the interpreting skill might be innate, or that there's an X factor in interpreting. So I thought maybe they think they don't need to practice, because if there's an X factor, you either have it or you don't. But then they wouldn't have had to engage in all these other activities they told me about. Because when it comes to their job, they don't take anything for granted. So, my speculations has boiled down to two suggestions. And first, that although interpreters are told, and perhaps also taught, to practice at interpreting training, perhaps the practice is not taught as a holistic and lifelong exercise. Interpreters do not perceive all the different activities they engaged in as practice. They don't see that all this will improve their skill and make them better interpreters. We see it as isolated items. I have to improve my language skills, I have to listen to the news, I should work on my legal terminology. But we fail to see how it builds up as one whole, how it is a lifelong engagement. And why is this important then? Well, it is important because if we see it as a whole, we become more efficient at becoming better interpreters. To me, there is no X factor in interpreting. It's long, hard work. And I think we should learn to be as goal-focused as top athletes. This is what Maria Cristina de la Vega told us about on her blog, about what we should learn from her brother, who is the long-distance runner, Alberto Salazar. And this is him winning his third consecutive New York Marathon in 1982. Then you have to be really goal-focused, right? But finally, I would also like to ask, how much incentives do interpreters have to get better? We strive to pass an exam or an accreditation test, but once we pass that, what is our incentive to continue to develop? There are no awards in interpreting. We will not win any gold medals for brilliant interpreting. Our pay will not increase if we deliver excellent interpreting. There is no Interpreters' Hall of Fame. So the interpreters I interviewed, they talked about a strong positive feeling when they felt they were really good, or the kick they got when they saw how people really understood each other, or the harmony of bringing order into chaos. I like that harmony thing. And I like those sources of personal satisfaction, but I'm not sure that that will make up for the absence of money, award, or fame. So what I learned from these interviews were first that practice for interpreters should be conscious, lifelong, and I also think we need platforms for that. We need platforms for continued education of the interpreting skill, lifelong learning, boot camps for interpreting practice, or maybe interpreting coaches. We need to create external incentives too, not just strong positive feelings. I don't think that's enough. So I'd like to suggest an Oscar for best interpreting. Right? Thank you so much.